Between 1847 and 1851, 17 enslaved men were recorded as deceased at a plantation in Lauderdale County, Alabama, their deaths documented in ledgers as routine property losses with the simple notation, natural causes. What made these deaths remarkable wasn't their number. Mortality rates on plantations were tragically high throughout the South, but rather the unusual pattern they followed. Every single deceased worker was a recently purchased male between the ages of 17 and 24, and every death occurred within 6 months of arrival at Blackridge Plantation. County purchasing records show that the plantation's owner, Cornelius Vanderhorn, paid premium prices for these workers, between $800 and $1,000 each, yet recorded their deaths with the same clinical detachment one might use for broken farm equipment. During this same period, neighboring plantations reported dozens of escape attempts, yet Blackridge recorded none. The local sheriff visited the property once in response to an anonymous complaint, spent less than an hour on site, and filed a 3-word report. Matter resolved privately. Before we continue with the story of Blackridge Plantation and its unusual mortality patterns, I want to ask you something. This channel exists because viewers like you appreciate these historical investigations into forgotten mysteries. If you're listening from somewhere in the American South or anywhere else in the world, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're from. And please hit that subscribe button, because the documents that survived from Blackridge reveal a systematic pattern that challenges our understanding of plantation operations during the antebellum period. The story of Blackridge didn't emerge through scandal or contemporary investigation. It surfaced in 1909 when a courthouse fire inadvertently preserved documents that had been deliberately misfiled in the wrong county's archives for over 50 years. Lauderdale County, Alabama, in the 1840s, represented the economic prosperity of the Cotton South. The Tennessee River provided lucrative trade routes, and by 1845, the county supported 43 major plantations, each competing for both agricultural success and social prestige among the planter class. The region's fertile soil made it ideal for cotton cultivation, and Florence, the county seat, had developed into a thriving commercial center with banks, merchants, and regular steamboat service. Blackridge Plantation occupied 1,200 acres along a gentle slope descending toward Cypress Creek. The main house, constructed in 1832, followed Greek Revival architecture, white columns, wide galleries, and design elements typical of wealthy southern estates. Cornelius Vanderhorn purchased the property in 1839 from a tobacco planter's estate, acquiring both land and 23 enslaved workers included in the transaction. Vanderhorn had accumulated wealth through cotton factoring in Savannah, serving as an intermediary between planters and textile manufacturers. His move to Alabama at age 51 represented a shift in ambition, from merchant to planter, from facilitating agricultural commerce to conducting it directly. His wife had died of fever in 1838, leaving him with one child. His daughter Eugenia, then 18 years old. Contemporary accounts of Eugenia Vanderhorn employ carefully diplomatic language. Church records describe her as substantial in constitution. Letters between planter families reference her considerable physical presence. Medical estimates based on these descriptions suggest she weighed between 280 and 320 pounds, an unusual condition in an era when most people engaged in regular physical labor. She rarely participated in Florence social functions, and when she did, she remained close to her father, speaking minimally and withdrawing from extended interaction. Cornelius Vanderhorn managed Blackridge with exceptional attention to documentation. His plantation journals, which survived the 1909 courthouse fire due to misfiling, reveal meticulous record-keeping. Every cotton bale was weighed and recorded. Every tool purchase included vendor information and cost. Every enslaved person was catalogued with estimated age, health assessment, work capacity, and known family connections. He hired Marcus Gritton, a Tennessee overseer known for maintaining efficient operations without excessive physical discipline. not from moral opposition to violence, but from the practical belief that damaged workers meant reduced productivity. Between 1839 and 1847, Blackridge's enslaved population grew from 23 to 41 people. Vanderhorn made strategic purchases, focusing particularly on young men between 16 and 25, workers who could maintain high productivity for decades. He attended auctions in Florence and Huntsville, occasionally traveling to Nashville for estate sales. The plantation appeared to operate as a standard agricultural enterprise, producing cotton yields consistent with other properties of similar size in the county. What county records and later testimony would reveal, however, was that beginning in 1847, Vanderhorn's purchasing patterns changed in ways that would only become clear years later. He began asking slave traders questions that had nothing to do with fieldwork capacity, questions about temperament, about specific physical characteristics, about whether young men had shown tendencies toward resistance. He was, it would later become apparent, shopping for something other than agricultural laborers. The first indication of unusual activity at Blackridge appears in Vanderhorn's March 1847 ledger entry for Isaiah Pruitt, age 19, purchased from a Huntsville trader. The entry includes standard information: height, weight, dental condition, visible scars, but concludes with a phrase not found in previous purchase records. Suitable for ease purpose. Quiet disposition essential. Isaiah worked standard field assignments for approximately 3 weeks. Then, according to Overseer Gritton's work logs, he was reassigned to house duties in mid-April. Such reassignments weren't inherently unusual. Enslaved people frequently moved between field labor and domestic service. What was unusual was the complete absence of specific duty descriptions. Gritton's logs state only, Isaiah to main house per master's instruction, not to be assigned field work until further notice. Harriet Oakes, who worked as cook at Blackridge, later provided testimony during an 1896 legal proceeding unrelated to the plantation's primary activities. By then 73 years old, her memory of specific dates had faded, but she recalled changes in household routines that began in April 1847. Meal preparations changed that spring, Harriet testified. I received instructions to prepare evening trays with portions for 2 people to be left at the base of the main staircase rather than delivered directly to Miss Eugenia's room. This arrangement continued for approximately 11 days. Then, Isaiah returned to field assignments. Isaiah Pruitt developed what Gritton's log describes as fever and respiratory complaint 3 weeks after returning to field work. He was moved to the isolation cabin used for sick workers. Ruth, an enslaved woman with medical knowledge passed from her grandmother, tended to ill workers when needed. According to statements her daughter later shared with a WPA interviewer in 1936, Isaiah's symptoms didn't match typical fever presentations common in the region. Isaiah died on June 2, 1847. Vanderhorn's ledger records: Isaiah, deceased, natural causes, fever, financial loss, $890. Below that appears, reassessment needed for durability factors. 8 weeks later, Vanderhorn purchased another young man, Thomas Belk, age 21, bought at a Florence auction in late July. The ledger includes the same notation, suitable for ease purpose. Thomas was assigned to the main house for 9 days before returning to fieldwork. He died in mid-September, wasting sickness, according to Gritton's log. Another financial loss of approximately $900. In October, Vanderhorn purchased Jacob Reese, age 18. Jacob spent 2 weeks assigned to the main house. He died in early November. The pattern had established itself with mechanical regularity, though its full implications wouldn't become clear for years. Between June 1847 and December 1847, 3 strong young men died at Blackridge under similar circumstances. Each had been recently purchased at premium prices. Each had been temporarily reassigned from field work to unspecified house duties. Each had died within weeks of returning to field assignments. The causes listed, fever, wasting sickness, respiratory complaints, were common enough diagnoses in an era of limited medical knowledge. But the consistency of the pattern was statistically improbable. Marcus Gritton, whose position required him to track all factors affecting plantation productivity, recognized that losing 3 prime workers in 6 months represented a significant operational problem. In November 1847, he requested a private meeting with Vanderhorn. This meeting is documented in correspondence Gritton sent to his brother in Tennessee, correspondence that survived in family papers and eventually came to light during the 1909 courthouse fire. I approached Mr. Vanderhorn regarding the matter of unusual mortality among recently purchased workers, Gritton wrote. I expressed concern that such losses would affect our cotton yields and suggested that new purchases should be seasoned in field work before any house assignments. Mr. Vanderhorn listened without visible reaction, then provided an explanation I had not anticipated. He stated that the deaths, while financially unfortunate, resulted from a medical necessity related to his daughter's health condition. He described it as a treatment prescribed by a physician in Savannah years earlier, something related to nervous disorders common among women of delicate constitution. He explained that the treatment required the presence of young, healthy men, and that their subsequent deaths indicated weak constitutions unsuitable for the particular demands of the work. He then asked if I understood my role as overseer, which was to maintain plantation operations and keep family matters confidential. I understood his meaning clearly. What Vanderhorn described to Gritton represented a distortion of actual medical theories circulating in the 1840s. Physicians of that era did believe that various women's nervous conditions could be treated through specific physical therapies. The concept of hysteria and its various treatments had existed in medical literature for centuries. However, no legitimate medical authority would have prescribed a treatment resulting in the systematic deaths of the individuals involved in administering it. Vanderhorn had essentially created a medical justification for a practice that would prove to be systematic exploitation, and he documented it with the same clinical precision he applied to cotton yields and equipment purchases. Between 1847 and 1851, 17 young men cycled through this system. Their names appear in Vanderhorn's ledger with consistent formatting: Isaiah Pruitt, Thomas Belk, Jacob Reese, William Dobbs, Robert Farley, Joseph Kimball, Samuel Heath, Benjamin Cross, Daniel Fletcher, Christopher Wade, Michael Brennan, Alexander Stone, Henry Talbot, Charles Morrow, Edward Price, Matthew Tolley, Andrew Sutton. Ages ranging from 17 to 24. Purchase prices between $800 and $1,000. Duration of house service varying from 1 to 3 weeks. Causes of death universally recorded as fever, wasting illness, or respiratory failure. Total financial loss, $15,300, a sum Vanderhorn noted in an 1851 accounting summary as acceptable expense relative to maintaining ease, health, and household stability. The enslaved community at Blackridge developed awareness of the pattern, though open discussion was impossible. Survival depended on not drawing attention, not asking questions, not challenging the established order. But knowledge circulated nonetheless. Young men began to recognize danger in being purchased by Blackridge. In Florence's slave market, some traders quietly steered Vanderhorn toward workers with pre-existing health issues, calculating that if death was inevitable, it might as well be someone already compromised. Other traders simply didn't concern themselves with such considerations. A sale was a sale, and the dead couldn't file complaints. What remains remarkable about this period is how completely Vanderhorn maintained his social standing in Florence. He attended First Presbyterian Church regularly, sometimes accompanied by Eugenia, sometimes alone. He served on the County Agricultural Improvement Board. He hosted occasional dinners for fellow planters. He paid debts promptly and maintained his property impeccably. No one in white society suspected irregularities, or if they did, they chose not to investigate. The privacy of plantation operations was considered sacrosanct. What happened on a man's property, particularly regarding the people he owned, was his business alone. This arrangement continued without interruption until January 1851. when two events occurred that would begin to unravel Vanderhoorn's carefully maintained system. First, Eugenia discovered she was pregnant. Second, the county sheriff received an anonymous letter. The pregnancy became apparent to household staff in late February 1851. Harriet Oakes, who had borne 6 children before being sold away from them, recognized the early signs. Following household protocol, she informed Vanderhoorn that Miss Eugenia would require wardrobe adjustments for changing proportions. According to Harriet's later testimony, Vanderhoorn's reaction was immediate and concerning. He appeared not angry, but genuinely frightened, as if confronting an outcome he hadn't properly planned for. He instructed Harriet to prepare specific herbal teas, pennyroyal and black cohosh, herbs known in that era for their properties in ending early pregnancies. Harriet prepared the teas as instructed. They proved ineffective. By July 1851, Eugenia was approximately 7 months pregnant, her condition impossible to conceal from household staff. Vanderhoorn had stopped inviting visitors to the property, and Eugenia had entirely ceased appearing in Florence. The pregnancy represented a crisis that Vanderhoorn's documented system hadn't anticipated. An illegitimate child would destroy Eugenia's already minimal social prospects, but more critically, it would inevitably prompt questions about paternity, questions that could expose the entire arrangement. Meanwhile, the anonymous letter had created its own complications. It arrived at Sheriff Coleman Pettigrew's office in early February 1851, postmarked from Florence with no return address. The letter survived the 1909 courthouse fire, preserved in an evidence file for an unrelated case. The handwriting was educated and deliberately disguised. Sheriff Pettigrew, you should inquire into the unusual mortality among young Negro men at Blackridge Plantation. 17 deaths in 4 years, all following similar patterns, all shortly after purchase. Mr. Vanderhoorn's ledgers will show financial losses he appears willing to sustain. A man doesn't lose 17 strong workers to fever unless factors beyond fever are operating. The community deserves protection from whatever illness or conditions exist at that property. A concerned citizen. Sheriff Pettigrew, while not an abolitionist or particularly concerned with enslaved people's welfare, was troubled by anything suggesting disorder in his jurisdiction. 17 deaths did seem statistically unusual. In late March 1851, he rode to Blackridge unannounced, characterizing his visit as routine inspection in response to health concerns. Vanderhoorn met him on the front gallery. They conversed for approximately 40 minutes. No detailed record of their conversation exists. Pettigrew's official report contains only 3 words. But Harriet Oakes was working in the house that day and overheard fragments through open windows. The sheriff asked about the deaths, Harriet testified. Master Vanderhoorn showed him the ledgers, pointed out all the documented financial losses, said he'd learned expensive lessons about purchasing from certain traders. Then Master Vanderhoorn's voice became quieter, and I heard him mention family medical matters and private physician's instructions. Whatever specifics he provided changed the sheriff's entire demeanor. The official tone became friendly. They spoke a few more minutes, then the sheriff departed. He didn't inspect the quarters, didn't interview any workers, just rode away. The official report filed March 24, 1851, stated only, "Matter resolved privately." What Vanderhoorn likely explained to Pettigrew, what convinced a law enforcement officer to abandon an investigation into 17 suspicious deaths, was some version of his medical justification. He probably framed it as doctor-prescribed therapy for a women's nervous condition, something Pettigrew would recognize within the medical context of the era. He likely suggested that deaths resulted from unfortunate complications with weak constitutions, not deliberate harm. And critically, he probably reminded Pettigrew that what occurred between a master and his property, especially regarding family medical matters, fell outside legal jurisdiction. Pettigrew accepted this explanation. He wrote 3 words and closed the file. To pursue the matter further would mean exposing aspects of plantation life that polite society preferred to keep private. The extent to which enslaved people were used for purposes beyond labor, purposes that ventured into medical experimentation and personal exploitation. Investigating Blackridge too deeply meant acknowledging realities that threatened the entire social structure of the slaveholding South. The identity of the letter writer was never discovered. Someone with education, with access to information about Vanderhorn's purchases, with sufficient conscience or anger to risk exposure. But that person remained anonymous, and the letter achieved nothing beyond a perfunctory visit that changed nothing. By August 1851, Eugenia's pregnancy was undeniable. Vanderhorn had stopped purchasing young men after Matthew Tolley died in March. Whether because the sheriff's visit concerned him or because Eugenia's condition made continuing impractical, records don't specify. The household existed in tense quiet. Vanderhorn spent hours in his study, writing correspondence he burned after sealing. On September 14, 1851, Eugenia gave birth. Harriet Oakes and another enslaved woman named Dinah attended the delivery in Eugenia's bedroom. No doctor was summoned. No white midwife called. The baby was a boy, small but healthy, with skin tone noticeably darker than Eugenia's pale complexion and hair texture suggesting mixed parentage. According to Harriet's testimony, Eugenia held the child briefly, perhaps 5 minutes, before Vanderhorn entered the room. He looked at the infant once, then instructed Harriet and Dinah to prepare the child for travel. That night, Vanderhorn placed the infant in a wooden box lined with cotton wool and drove north toward the Tennessee River, accompanied by Harriet. What happened during that journey remained unclear in Harriet's testimony. She stated only that they traveled to a ferry crossing near Culbert's Landing, remained there briefly, then returned to Blackridge with the infant. Days later, a man from Savannah, someone Harriet identified only as a business associate of Master Vanderhorn, visited the plantation, stayed for 2 hours, and departed with the child. The baby disappeared into private adoption networks that operated below legal documentation, one more child severed from origin and family. Whether he survived to adulthood remains unknown. Eugenia recovered slowly from childbirth. By October, she was taking meals downstairs again, moving through the house with her customary quiet. She never mentioned the child. It was as if the pregnancy and birth had been administratively deleted from household reality. But something had changed in Cornelius Vanderhorn's operations. The sheriff's visit had created vulnerability. The pregnancy had exposed flaws in his system. He didn't purchase any new young men after the birth. Gritton's logs from late 1851 through 1852 show standard fieldwork assignments with no unusual house service designations. Blackridge appeared to return to conventional plantation operations. This pause proved temporary. By April 1853, Vanderhorn resumed his previous pattern. The ledger shows, Solomon Wade, age 20, purchased Florence auction, $920, suitable for ease purpose. The cycle of deaths began again. Between 1853 and 1857, 8 additional young men died at Blackridge following the established pattern. Their names joined the documented list: Solomon Wade, Aaron Butler, Joshua Parrish, Nathaniel Hughes, Ezra Collins, Caleb Jessup, Isaac Vaughn, Jonah Carpenter. Each purchased at premium prices, each temporarily assigned to house service, each dying within weeks of returning to field work, each buried in the far corner of the property, where graves had become numerous enough to form distinct rows. The pattern's consistency began generating broader awareness beyond Blackridge's boundaries. Enslaved people who'd been sold away from the plantation carried fragmented knowledge to neighboring properties. Not complete information. Few people knew full details except household staff, but enough pieces to create reputation. In Florence's slave market, certain traders noticed that strong young men sometimes showed visible fear upon learning they'd been purchased by Cornelius Vanderhorn. A Huntsville trader named Wickham kept informal transaction notes in a family Bible. In an entry dated July 1856, he wrote, "Sold boy named Caleb to C. Vanderhorn of Lauderdale County." The boy heard the name and showed considerable distress, asked if sale could be redirected elsewhere. I informed him the transaction was complete. He asked if I was a Christian man. I confirmed I was. He requested I pray for him, stating he expected to die at that place. I thought his response dramatic at the time. Later learned he did indeed die, approximately 4 months after purchase. Gives one pause for consideration. Yet such considerations never translated into investigation. Questioning one planter's operations too closely might invite questions about others, and everyone preferred the existing arrangement where plantation affairs remained private. By late 1856, Cornelius Vanderhoorn's health had begun deteriorating. He developed symptoms consistent with what was likely prostate cancer, difficulty urinating, chronic lower back and abdominal pain, episodes of bleeding. By early 1857, his decline was visible. Significant weight loss, jaundiced complexion, increasing immobility. He could no longer travel to Florence for auctions or manage daily plantation oversight. Marcus Gritton, who'd served as overseer for 18 years, made a decision. In March 1857, he wrote to his brother, "Mr. Vanderhoorn is clearly failing. I estimate 6 months remaining at most. When he passes, I will be leaving this property. I've witnessed things here that weigh on my conscience, and I won't remain to serve his daughter when she inherits. Someone else can manage whatever Blackridge becomes next." Vanderhoorn died on August 11, 1857, at age 69. A doctor from Florence attended his final days, providing laudanum for pain management. The death notice in the Florence Gazette praised him as a pillar of agricultural excellence, devoted father, and gentleman of steady Christian principle. His funeral drew substantial attendance from the planter community. Eugenia inherited everything at age 36, the plantation, its 1,200 acres, and its 47 enslaved workers. Florence society quietly speculated about what the reclusive Miss Vanderhoorn would do with such a substantial operation. The general assumption was that she'd either sell the property or hire male relatives to manage it. Women weren't expected to run agricultural enterprises independently. She did neither. Marcus Gritton departed within 2 weeks of Vanderhoorn's death, exactly as he'd promised. The new overseer, Hollis Crenshaw, was 28 years old and unaware of Blackridge's history. He saw only a well-maintained plantation with good land and adequate workforce. He accepted Eugenia's employment offer in September 1857 and moved into the overseer's residence expecting straightforward agricultural management. For 4 months, operations proceeded normally. Cotton was harvested and sold. Winter preparations advanced on schedule. Eugenia remained in the main house, communicating through written instructions delivered by Harriet Oakes. Crenshaw began thinking that stories about the strange Miss Vanderhoorn were exaggerated. Then, in January 1858, Eugenia gave Crenshaw unusual instructions. She wanted him to purchase a specific individual, Lucas Thornberry, currently held in Florence jail on charges of attempted escape from a neighboring plantation. She wanted Crenshaw to negotiate his purchase and bring him to Blackridge within the week. Crenshaw initially questioned the wisdom of purchasing a convicted runaway. Such individuals often attempted escape again, and recovery costs rarely justified the discounted purchase price. But Eugenia insisted. Crenshaw traveled to Florence, negotiated with the sheriff, and paid $750 for Lucas Thornberry, whose crime was attempting to reach freedom and whose punishment was sail away from his family. Lucas arrived at Blackridge on January 19, 1858, in chains. He was 22 years old, strongly built from fieldwork, his back showing scars from punishment received after his capture. Crenshaw expected Lucas would be assigned to the most demanding fieldwork as both punishment and warning to other workers. Instead, Eugenia gave orders that confused Crenshaw entirely. Lucas was to be unchained, given quarters in a room adjacent to the kitchen, formerly storage space, now furnished with bed and chair, and provided with clothing superior to what field workers wore. He was to be fed from the main house kitchen. His duties were described vaguely as household maintenance and companionship. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Blackridge intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because what Eugenia created after her father's death would prove to be an evolution of his system, different in method, but equally disturbing in its implications. I didn't immediately understand what she meant by companionship. Crenshaw wrote years later in correspondence that surfaced during an 1889 court case. I thought perhaps she required someone for heavy lifting or household repairs. It took approximately 2 weeks before I understood the actual arrangement. When I did, I comprehended why Marcus Gritton had departed so quickly. What Crenshaw gradually understood was that Eugenia had modified her father's approach. Cornelius had cycled through young men until they died, treating them as expendable resources requiring constant replacement. This method had been expensive, dangerous, and ultimately unsustainable. Eugenia's modification was coldly practical. Instead of cycling through individuals, she would maintain one person permanently, keeping him in adequate health, creating a stable arrangement that wouldn't attract attention through frequent purchases or mysterious deaths. Lucas was given the room by the kitchen, furnished with items from unused bedrooms. He received adequate nutrition, including meat several times weekly, far better than typical field worker diets. He wasn't subjected to brutal agricultural labor. From an external perspective, Lucas had been given an enviable position: house service with minimal physical demands and superior living conditions. But every evening, Lucas was required to go upstairs to Eugenia's bedroom. The arrangement followed the pattern her father had established, but regularized and made permanent rather than temporary. Lucas understood his options. He could comply and live in relative comfort, or resist and be sold back to authorities, likely ending up on a Mississippi cotton plantation, where life expectancy for male field workers averaged less than a decade. He'd already attempted escape once, and been brutally punished for it. So he made the calculation that countless enslaved people had made throughout history. He chose survival. For 3 years, Lucas lived in that room adjacent to the kitchen. He ate adequately. He wasn't beaten, he wasn't worked in fields. But every evening he went upstairs, and what occurred there was the systematic exploitation that had killed 25 men before him. Except now it was permanent condition rather than temporary horror. Harriet Oakes observed this arrangement with complicated emotions. The deaths had stopped. No more graves appeared in the far corner of the property. But what Lucas experienced seemed in some ways worse than quick death, because it was suffering extended indefinitely and normalized into daily routine. Lucas would eat his supper at the kitchen table. Harriet testified years later. We'd have ordinary conversation about weather or crops. Then evening would arrive, and he'd head upstairs as if going to any job. He'd return perhaps an hour later to his room. I never heard him complain or cry, he just existed. That quiet acceptance was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole arrangement. In November 1860, Eugenia discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy unfolded differently from the first. There was no panic, no attempt at herbal abortion, no midnight journey toward the Tennessee River. Eugenia simply continued her routine as her body changed, making practical arrangements as if pregnancy were merely another condition requiring management. Harriet Oakes observed this calm acceptance with considerable unease. Miss Eugenia discussed the pregnancy in purely practical terms, Harriet later testified. She instructed me to alter her dresses for changing proportions, to prepare one of the upstairs rooms as a nursery, to order specific supplies from Florence merchants. She spoke about it the way one might discuss cotton planting schedules, purely administrative, without visible emotion. The pregnancy progressed through winter into early spring. During this period, Blackridge's operations continued with relative normalcy. Hollis Crenshaw managed fieldwork, overseeing cotton planting for the 1861 season. Lucas Thornberry maintained his established routine, living in the room by the kitchen, performing his assigned duties. The household functioned as it had for the previous 3 years, with the pregnancy simply incorporated into existing patterns rather than disrupting them. What made this pregnancy different from the first wasn't just Eugenia's emotional response. It was the broader historical context in which it occurred. The nation was fracturing. 7 southern states had seceded from the Union by February 1861, forming the Confederate States of America. Alabama had voted for secession in January. Political tensions that had simmered for decades were reaching critical mass, and everyone understood that some form of conflict was inevitable, though few predicted the scale or duration of what would come. In Florence, men of military age began organizing volunteer companies. Merchants stockpiled goods, anticipating supply disruptions. Planters discussed what war might mean for agricultural operations and labor control. The social order that had seemed permanent and natural was beginning to show cracks, and enslaved people throughout the region were watching those cracks carefully, understanding that crisis created opportunity. The baby was born on March 12, 1861, exactly 1 week after Abraham Lincoln's inauguration as the 16th president. Harriet Oakes and Dinah attended the delivery, which proceeded without complications. The infant was a boy, small but healthy, weighing approximately 6 pounds. His physical characteristics indicated mixed parentage. Skin tone several shades darker than Eugenia's pale complexion, hair with distinctive texture, facial features that would make his ancestry obvious to any observer. Eugenia held the child for perhaps 10 minutes after delivery, examining him with what Harriet described as clinical interest, as if studying a specimen rather than a newborn. Then she handed him to Harriet with simple, clear instructions. "His name is James. He will be raised in this house. Prepare the nursery accordingly." That decision created a legal paradox, unique even within slavery's already contradictory framework. Under the legal principle of partus sequitur ventrum, that which is brought forth follows the womb, children inherited the status of their mother. Since Eugenia was white and free, one might assume James would be free as well. However, James's father was enslaved, which complicated matters. Different states interpreted such situations differently, and in Alabama, the child of a white woman and enslaved man occupied ambiguous legal territory. Eugenia resolved this ambiguity in a characteristically practical manner. She filed no birth certificate with county authorities. She made no legal declaration of James's status. She simply raised him in the main house as if he were a free child, while simultaneously maintaining absolute control over his circumstances in ways that replicated ownership without formal documentation. James existed in a space between categories, neither fully enslaved nor fully free, neither acknowledged as legitimate heir, nor formally designated as property. The nursery was established in an upstairs bedroom adjacent to Eugenia's own room. Harriet was assigned primary responsibility for James's daily care during infancy, though Eugenia maintained close oversight of all arrangements. The child was fed on a schedule Eugenia specified. His clothing was ordered from the same Florence merchants who supplied Eugenia's own wardrobe. As he grew from infant to toddler, he moved freely through the main house, not confined to quarters or restricted from spaces designated for white family members. Lucas Thornberry's relationship to his biological son was never officially acknowledged. He saw James daily. The child would toddle through the kitchen during mealtimes, would play in the hallway visible from the kitchen door, would eventually grow old enough to speak and interact with household staff. But Lucas was forbidden from identifying himself as James's father, from developing any parental relationship, from even addressing the child directly beyond basic household courtesies one might extend to any employer's child. Harriet observed these interactions with what she later described as profound discomfort. Mr. Lucas would be sitting at the kitchen table when James would run through, laughing, playing as children do. Mr. Lucas would watch him with an expression I cannot adequately describe, something between joy and grief, between love and pain, but he never reached out, never called to him, never attempted interaction beyond a polite nod if James looked in his direction. Miss Eugenia had made the boundaries clear. Mr. Lucas's role was specific and singular, and fatherhood was not part of that role. Violating those boundaries meant being sold away, which would mean never seeing James again. So Mr. Lucas maintained silence and watched his son grow 3 feet away from him. The arrangement revealed the extent to which Eugenia had internalized and adapted her father's systems of control. Cornelius had exercised power through threat of death and replacement. Eugenia exercised power through something more subtle and potentially more effective: the threat of permanent separation from the one thing that might give Lucas reason to endure his circumstances. James became, without anyone explicitly stating it, the leverage that kept Lucas compliant. As James grew from infant to toddler to young child, his presence in the household created additional complications. By age 3, he was speaking fluently. By age 4, he was asking questions about household dynamics that were difficult to answer. Why does Mr. Lucas live in the kitchen room? Why doesn't Mr. Lucas eat supper with us? Why don't I have a papa like other children? These questions, innocent in their origin, threatened to expose the carefully maintained fiction of Blackridge's household arrangements. Eugenia's response was to begin formal education earlier than typical. In 1865, when James was 4 years old, she hired a tutor, a free black man named Solomon Washington, who lived in Florence and had received education through missionary schools before the war. Washington visited Blackridge 3 times weekly, teaching James basic literacy, arithmetic, and what he carefully described in later interviews as appropriate deportment for a child of uncertain station. Washington's hiring itself was remarkable. In 1865, the Civil War had just ended. Emancipation was freshly declared, and the entire social structure of the South was in violent flux. Yet, Eugenia Vanderhorn, a white woman living alone on a deteriorating plantation, hired a black man to educate a mixed-race child whose legal status was undefined. This decision suggested either remarkable pragmatism or complete disconnection from social conventions, possibly both. Miss Vanderhorn interviewed me very carefully before offering employment. Washington recalled in an 1893 interview with a Northern journalist researching post-war Alabama. She asked about my educational background, my teaching philosophy, my understanding of discretion. She made clear that James's education must be thorough, but that discussions of family matters were not appropriate subjects for instruction. I was to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography. I was not to inquire about household arrangements or discuss them with anyone in Florence. The compensation she offered was generous enough that I accepted those terms. Washington taught James for 3 years, from 1865 to 1868. During that period, he observed a household that he described as profoundly abnormal, even accounting for the general abnormality of post-war plantation life. The main house was deteriorating, paint peeling, roof leaking in several rooms, furniture showing signs of neglect. The few field workers who remained worked sporadically and were rarely paid on time. Eugenia herself appeared increasingly disconnected from practical reality, sometimes giving contradictory instructions, sometimes failing to respond to direct questions. But James's education continued with meticulous consistency. Washington arrived every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 o'clock in the morning. He taught in a small upstairs room designated as the schoolroom. James proved to be an intelligent, eager student, mastering reading far ahead of typical schedules and showing particular aptitude for mathematics and geography. James asked me once about his father, Washington recalled. He was perhaps 6 years old at the time. He said, "Mr. Washington, everyone has a papa. Where is mine?" I told him that was a question for his mother, not his tutor. He accepted that answer but looked deeply unsatisfied. A few weeks later he asked, "Is Mr. Lucas my papa?" I told him again that such questions were outside my purview as an educator. He never asked again in my presence, but I believe he had arrived at his own conclusions. Meanwhile, the Civil War had progressed from anticipated brief conflict to prolonged catastrophe. Fort Sumter fell in April 1861, the same month James was born. The First Battle of Bull Run in July shattered Union assumptions about quick victory. By 1862, the war had become a grinding struggle of attrition, with casualties mounting to levels that shocked both sides. Lauderdale County, while not a major battleground, felt the war's effects significantly. Young men enlisted in Confederate units, the 4th Alabama Infantry, the 9th Alabama Infantry, various cavalry companies. Many never returned. Those who did often came back wounded or broken. The economy contracted severely as Union blockades restricted trade and inflation made Confederate currency increasingly worthless. For enslaved people throughout the region, the war represented the first realistic hope for freedom many had ever known. News traveled through informal networks, whispered conversations, information passed between plantations, reports from travelers. People learned that Union policy had evolved from merely suppressing rebellion to actively dismantling slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued January 1, 1863, declared enslaved people in rebel states to be free, though enforcement depended entirely on Union military presence. Northern Alabama's proximity to Tennessee, which came under Union control relatively early in the war, meant that escape toward Union lines was potentially achievable. Throughout 1863 and 1864, enslaved people from Lauderdale County plantations attempted to reach federal forces. Some succeeded. Many were caught and punished with brutal severity. The threat of mass escape terrified white Southerners, who understood that their entire economic and social system depended on keeping enslaved people under control. At Blackridge, several individuals attempted escape during the war years. Hollis Crenshaw's overseer logs, which survived in fragmentary form, document at least 5 attempted escapes between 1862 and 1863. 2 people successfully reached Union lines. 3 were captured and returned. Eugenia's response to these escapes was to hire a new overseer in late 1863, a man named Skinner, whose first name doesn't appear in any surviving records, but whose reputation for brutal enforcement preceded him. Crenshaw himself enlisted in Confederate service in September 1863, joining a cavalry company forming in Florence. He survived the war and eventually returned to Tennessee, where he lived until 1891. In an 1889 letter to his nephew, he reflected on his time at Blackridge. I served as overseer there for 6 years, from 1857 to 1863. In all that time, I never fully understood the household arrangements. Miss Vanderhorn operated under rules of her own devising, and I learned quickly that my role was to manage field operations and not inquire into domestic matters. When I enlisted, I felt relief at leaving that place, though I would not have said so at the time. Some plantations feel cursed, not by supernatural means, but by the accumulated weight of human choices, and Blackridge had that quality. Skinner, the new overseer, brought methods that Crenshaw had avoided. Whippings increased in frequency. Work hours extended. Food rations were reduced as wartime shortages affected supply chains. The relatively ordered system that had existed under Crenshaw gave way to an atmosphere of fear and deprivation. Several workers who'd remained at Blackridge through the early war years decided that escape toward Union lines, despite its dangers, was preferable to remaining under Skinner's management. Lucas Thornberry remained in his room by the kitchen throughout these years. His legal status was the same as other enslaved people at Blackridge. He was property, owned by Eugenia, subject to her complete control. But his circumstances were different. He lived in the main house. He ate better than field workers. He wasn't subjected to Skinner's brutality. He saw his son daily, even if he couldn't acknowledge paternity. These relative advantages, however, came at a cost that was perhaps heavier than field labor would have been. Field workers, at least, had some degree of community, some opportunity for human connection beyond relationships defined by exploitation. Lucas lived in isolation, his only regular interactions being with Eugenia and household staff who understood but couldn't discuss his situation. His role was singular and specific, and everything else in his life, including his relationship with his own son, was subordinated to maintaining that role. Harriet Oakes, observing Lucas during these years, noted subtle changes. Mr. Lucas had always been quiet, even in the early years after he arrived. But during the war, that quietness became something different, something more like absence. He would sit at the kitchen table, eating whatever I'd prepared, and his face would be perfectly blank. Not sad, not angry, not anything. Just blank, as if he'd learned to remove himself entirely from present experience, to exist somewhere internal where what happened to his body didn't touch whatever remained of his self. I'd seen that look before, in people who'd endured things that broke something fundamental inside them. Mr. Lucas had that look. The war ended in April 1865, with Lee's surrender at Appomattox. News reached Lauderdale County within days, traveling faster than it might have in peacetime due to the intense attention everyone paid to war developments. The Confederacy had collapsed. Slavery was finished. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, made emancipation constitutional law throughout the United States. But freedom, when it came to northern Alabama, came as a complicated, dangerous negotiation rather than a simple declaration. Federal troops were present in the region but thinly spread. Many white Southerners were determined to restore antebellum racial control through different means: vagrancy laws, apprenticeship systems, labor contracts that replicated slavery in everything but name, and outright violence against black people who asserted their freedom too boldly. For formerly enslaved people, navigating this new landscape required careful calculation. Freedom was real, legally, definitively real, but survival in freedom required resources, opportunities, and protections that were scarce. Many people stayed on the plantations where they'd been enslaved, not because they wanted to, but because immediate alternatives seemed even more dangerous. At Blackridge, emancipation meant different things to different people. For most of the workers, it meant immediate departure. Within weeks of understanding that they were legally free to leave, approximately 30 of the 47 people who'd been enslaved there walked away. Some headed toward Florence, seeking wage labor in a town whose economy had collapsed, but which still offered more opportunities than plantation work. Others traveled north toward Tennessee, where Union military presence was stronger, and aid organizations had established operations to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. A handful of people stayed, negotiating labor contracts with Eugenia. These contracts, common throughout the post-war South, theoretically established employer-employee relationships with wages, specified work hours, and mutual obligations. In practice, they often replicated slavery's essential dynamics: black workers providing labor, white employers maintaining control, compensation being minimal or non-existent, and mechanisms for enforcement favoring employers overwhelmingly. The contracts at Blackridge were particularly problematic because Eugenia had no money to pay wages. The war had destroyed Southern currency. Confederate bonds and banknotes were worthless. Land had value in theory, but couldn't be converted to cash without buyers, and no one was buying plantation land in 1865. Eugenia offered deferred compensation, promises of future payment once cotton could be grown, harvested, and sold. A few desperate workers accepted these terms, having nowhere else to go and hoping that some payment would eventually materialize. Harriet Oakes was not among those who stayed. She was 65 years old in July 1865 when she left Blackridge. She'd been at the plantation since 1847, 18 years, and had witnessed the full scope of what occurred there. She carried no possessions when she left, wanting nothing that would connect her to that place. She settled in Florence, taking whatever washing and cleaning work she could find. Florence in 1865 was a town struggling to survive economic collapse. Businesses closed, buildings deteriorating, unemployment widespread. But it was still preferable to Blackridge. Harriet rented a small room above a stable, worked 6 days a week at various households, attended services at First Baptist Church, where a community of formerly enslaved people was establishing itself. I walked away from that plantation with nothing but the dress I wore, and 20 years of memories I wished I could leave behind, Harriet said in her 1896 testimony. But memories don't work that way. You carry them whether you want to or not. I carried the memory of every young man who came to that house and never left it alive. I carried the memory of a baby in a box on the way to the river. I carried the memory of Mr. Lucas watching his son grow up 3 feet away without being able to speak to him. Those memories never left me, not in 30 years. Lucas Thornbury initially stayed at Blackridge after emancipation. This decision puzzles historians and has generated considerable scholarly debate about the psychological effects of prolonged exploitation and trauma. Lucas was free. He had no legal obligation to remain. He could have walked away as most others did. But he stayed in his room by the kitchen, continuing the same routines he'd followed for 7 years. Various theories have been proposed to explain this decision. Some historians suggest Lucas stayed because of James, that seeing his son daily, even without being able to acknowledge paternity, was preferable to being separated from him entirely. Others argue that Lucas had been so psychologically damaged by his circumstances that he couldn't imagine alternatives, that 7 years of systematic exploitation had destroyed his capacity to envision different possibilities for his life. Still others suggest that Eugenia maintained some form of psychological control, that legal emancipation couldn't immediately break, that patterns of domination established over years don't disappear simply because laws change. The most disturbing possibility, suggested by Eugenia's own behavior during this period, is that she simply didn't acknowledge that emancipation applied to Lucas. She continued giving him instructions as if nothing had changed. She continued expecting him to fulfill his assigned role. And Lucas, for reasons that can only be speculated about, continued complying. Solomon Washington, James's tutor, observed these dynamics during his visits to Blackridge between 1865 and 1868. The household existed in a state of profound denial about the war's outcome and emancipation's reality, he recalled. Miss Vanderhorn conducted herself as if the social order remained exactly as it had been in 1860. She gave instructions to Mr. Lucas and to the few workers who remained as if they were still her property. Most remarkably, many of them complied, at least initially. It took time for people to understand that legal freedom meant they could actually refuse, actually leave, actually assert autonomy. That understanding came gradually, unevenly, differently for each person. By 1867, Blackridge had effectively ceased functioning as an agricultural operation. No cotton was planted that spring. Fields that had been under cultivation for decades began reverting to wild growth. Fences rotted. Equipment rusted. The main house, already showing signs of neglect during the war, deteriorated further. Shutters hanging loose, roof leaking, paint peeling to bare wood. Eugenia herself showed signs of serious mental decline. Neighbors who occasionally encountered her, Blackridge was relatively isolated, but Florence residents would sometimes pass by on the road, reported seeing a woman who appeared much older than her 46 years. She was thin to the point of emaciation, her clothing dirty and ill-fitting, her hair uncombed. She would sometimes stand on the front gallery talking to herself, having animated conversations with people who weren't present. Several Florence residents expressed concern to county authorities about Eugenia's condition, suggesting that perhaps some intervention was needed. But county officials, overwhelmed with post-war chaos and having no clear legal framework for addressing such situations, took no action. White women of property, even deteriorating property, were presumed to have the right to manage their own affairs. Unless she posed immediate danger to others, Eugenia would be left alone. James was 6 years old in 1867, a bright, articulate child who read at levels far beyond his age. Solomon Washington continued tutoring him 3 days per week, though Eugenia's payments had become irregular, and Washington was essentially volunteering his time out of concern for the child's welfare. James was aware that something was wrong with his mother, Washington recalled. He would say things like, "Mama forgot to eat again today," or "Mama was talking to people I couldn't see." He understood that their household was different from others, that his own status was uncertain, that the world around them was changing in ways that might affect him significantly. But he was still a child, trying to make sense of circumstances that would have challenged adults. James's racial identity was becoming increasingly problematic as he grew older. In the fluid period immediately following emancipation, when social categories were being violently renegotiated, a light-skinned child of ambiguous status could occupy a kind of liminal space. But by 1867, as white Southerners worked to restore racial hierarchies through law and custom, that liminal space was closing. James would have to be categorized. He was too visibly black to be accepted as white, but his upbringing in the main house, his education, his manner of speaking, all set him apart from children who'd grown up in slave quarters and were now navigating freedom. In October 1867, James disappeared. The circumstances of his disappearance remain one of the most troubling unsolved aspects of the Blackridge case. No body was ever found. No witness reported seeing him leave or seeing anything happen to him. He simply ceased to exist in any documentation. No death certificate, no burial record, no census entry, nothing. Several theories have been proposed. Some accounts suggest James ran away, possibly attempting to reach relatives of his father's who lived in Tennessee. Lucas had occasionally mentioned to Harriet and others that he had a sister who'd been sold to a plantation near Nashville before the war. Perhaps James had heard of this aunt and decided to try finding her. This theory is supported by the fact that several children throughout the South did successfully navigate long-distance travel in the chaotic post-war period. Another theory, darker and less substantiated, suggests that James may have been killed, either by white supremacists who found his ambiguous status in education offensive or possibly in a tragic accident. The post-war South was extraordinarily violent, particularly toward black people who were perceived as not observing proper racial deference. A well-educated mixed-race child living in a deteriorating plantation might have attracted dangerous attention. The most disturbing possibility, whispered about in Florence for decades but never proven, was that Eugenia herself was responsible for James's disappearance. By October 1867, Eugenia's mental state had deteriorated significantly. It's possible that in a moment of psychotic break she harmed James, either deliberately or accidentally, and then suppressed or couldn't remember what had occurred. This theory is supported by the fact that when asked about James in subsequent months, Eugenia gave inconsistent answers, sometimes saying he'd been sent away to school, sometimes claiming not to know anyone named James, sometimes becoming agitated and refusing to discuss the matter. What is documented is that Lucas Thornbury noticed James's absence and confronted Eugenia about it. This confrontation was witnessed by one of the few remaining workers at Blackridge, a man named Peter, who later shared his account with family members. According to Peter, Lucas demanded to know where James was. Eugenia responded that James had been sent away for proper education in a suitable environment. Lucas pressed for details. Where specifically, under whose care, when would he return? Eugenia couldn't or wouldn't provide specifics, saying only that arrangements had been made and that it was no longer Lucas's concern. Lucas became angry. According to Peter, it was the first time anyone had seen him openly express anger in all his years at Blackridge. He shouted at Eugenia, demanding information about his son. Eugenia retreated into the house and locked the doors. Lucas spent the next several hours methodically searching the property, the main house grounds, the outbuildings, the far corners where graves had been dug years earlier, looking for any sign of what might have happened to James. He found nothing. The next morning, October 18, 1867, Lucas Thornbury left Blackridge. He walked away sometime before dawn, leaving his few possessions in his room by the kitchen. Where he went, what became of him, whether he ever learned what happened to his son, none of this is documented. Lucas disappears from historical record completely. After that morning, one more person erased by the catastrophes that unfolded at and around Blackridge Plantation. Eugenia continued living at Blackridge alone, or nearly alone. 1 or 2 workers remained, coming and going irregularly. Solomon Washington stopped making tutoring visits. There was no longer a student to teach. and Eugenia had stopped responding to his attempts to collect payment for previous work. The property continued deteriorating. Neighbors reported seeing smoke from the kitchen chimney irregularly, suggesting that Eugenia was eating only occasionally or that she'd stopped maintaining regular routines. In March 1869, a neighbor traveling past Blackridge noticed that no smoke had come from the chimneys for several days and that the main house appeared completely dark at night. Concerned, he alerted authorities in Florence. A sheriff's deputy rode out to the property and, receiving no response to his knocking, entered the house. He found Eugenia Vanderhorn dead in her upstairs bedroom. She appeared to have been deceased for approximately 3 to 5 days. The room contained no signs of violence or struggle. Eugenia was lying on her bed, fully clothed, severely emaciated. The deputy's report noted that the house contained adequate food supplies in the kitchen, preserved goods, flour, salted meat, suggesting that Eugenia hadn't starved from lack of food, but rather from inability or unwillingness to eat. The doctor who examined the body, Dr. Harold Sinclair from Florence, wrote in his report, "Cause of death, malnutrition and general debilitation. Deceased appears to have suffered from severe mental disturbance of extended duration. Evidence suggests patient was unable to maintain basic self-care in final weeks of life. Estimate weight at time of death approximately 90-95 pounds, down from previous documented weight of 300+ pounds. Death appears to have been gradual decline rather than acute event. Eugenia Vanderhorn died at age 48. A brief obituary appeared in the Florence Times. Miss Eugenia Vanderhorn, daughter of the late Cornelius Vanderhorn, passed away at her residence at Blackridge Plantation. Services to be held at First Presbyterian Church. Interment at Florence Cemetery. The obituary mentioned nothing about her life, her circumstances, or what had occurred at Blackridge during her lifetime and her father's. Her funeral was sparsely attended. Perhaps 15 people, mostly elderly acquaintances of her father's, who felt obligated to pay respects. She was buried in the Vanderhorn family plot at Florence Cemetery, next to Cornelius, under a simple granite stone reading, "Eugenia Vanderhorn, 1821-1869, daughter of Cornelius." The stone said nothing else. No verse, no epitaph, no summary of life. The property sat abandoned after Eugenia's death. No heirs came forward. Eugenia had never married, and James, her only child, had disappeared. The plantation reverted to Lauderdale County for unpaid taxes in 1871. County authorities attempted to sell it at auction in 1872, but the only bid came from a Memphis speculator who offered $300 for 1,200 acres, less than 25 cents per acre, reflecting both the depressed post-war economy and Blackridge's increasingly notorious reputation. The speculator visited the property once, spent perhaps an hour walking the grounds, then returned to Memphis and declined to complete the purchase. In a letter to the county tax assessor explaining his decision, he wrote, "Upon inspection, the property shows extensive deterioration beyond what might be economically repaired. Moreover, local residents have made clear that the plantation's history creates difficulties that transcend mere structural issues. I must respectfully withdraw my offer." The property reverted to county ownership again. In 1873, it was sold to a different buyer for $150. That buyer held it for 2 years, never visited, and let it go for unpaid taxes. This pattern repeated several times over the next decades, periodic sales to speculators who'd never seen the property, followed by abandonment and tax default. The main house burned in 1921. The cause was never determined, though arson was suspected. The fire occurred on August 11th, the anniversary of Cornelius Vanderhorn's death, which some people noted as potentially significant, though no evidence ever connected the date to the fire's origin. Local black residents in Florence noted the date's coincidence and suggested that perhaps someone who remembered Blackridge's history had chosen that particular night deliberately. No investigation pursued this theory. The slave quarters, already deteriorating, collapsed entirely by the 1930s. Scavengers took whatever materials could be salvaged. Lumber, bricks, metal fixtures. By 1940, only foundations remained, and even those were gradually being reclaimed by vegetation. The courthouse fire of 1909 inadvertently preserved Blackridge's documented history by damaging files in ways that required extensive reorganization. As clerks and attorneys sorted through smoke-damaged records, they pulled documents from incorrect filing locations and discovered materials that had been deliberately or accidentally misfiled for decades. Robert Finch, a young attorney assigned to catalog recovered documents, found Cornelius Vanderhorn's plantation journals filed with probate records from neighboring Colbert County. Completely wrong location, which explained why they'd never been examined during routine county record reviews. He also found Marcus Gritton's correspondence, Sheriff Pettigrew's files, ledgers documenting purchases and deaths, and dozens of other records that together painted a picture of systematic exploitation operating over decades. Finch was disturbed enough by what he read to write a detailed memorandum to County Prosecutor James Whitfield, suggesting that even though all principals were deceased, some form of official acknowledgement or investigation might be appropriate. The records suggest systematic abuse resulting in at least 25 documented deaths, Finch wrote. While criminal prosecution is impossible given that perpetrators are deceased, the county might consider some form of historical accounting or memorial to acknowledge what occurred. Prosecutor Whitfield read the memorandum, considered it for several days, then filed it in his desk drawer with a note. Insufficient public interest to justify expenditure of county resources on historical matters. Principals deceased. No living complainants. Matter closed. The memorandum sat in that drawer until Whitfield retired in 1923, when it was discovered during office cleaning and eventually made its way to county archives. But the documents themselves survived, and in 1923, local historian Dorothy Fitzgerald discovered them while researching Lauderdale County's antebellum period. She was writing a history of cotton agriculture in northern Alabama and had requested access to plantation records. What she found in the Blackridge materials shocked her sufficiently that she felt compelled to write about it. Her article, Troubling Records from a Pre-War Plantation, appeared in the Florence Times in November 1923. It was carefully worded, avoiding sensationalism while presenting the documented facts. 17 men purchased between 1847 and 1851, all dying within months of arrival, all under similar circumstances. 8 more deaths following the same pattern between 1853 and 1857. Ledger notations referring to ease purpose. Correspondence describing medical necessity, the complete absence of investigation or accountability. The article generated brief local controversy. Several letters to the editor appeared over the following weeks, some expressing shock, some dismissing the findings as exaggerated or misinterpreted, some arguing that dwelling on past events was unhelpful when the region was trying to rebuild and move forward. Within a month, the controversy had faded, displaced by more immediate concerns of the 1920s South. Harriet Oakes's 1896 testimony survived because it had been embedded in a completely unrelated legal proceeding. In 1895, a property dispute arose regarding land boundaries between 2 farms that had been carved from the former Blackridge Plantation. Attorneys for both sides sought testimony from elderly residents who remembered the property's original configuration and landmarks. Harriet was 73 years old when attorneys located her in Florence. She agreed to provide testimony, appearing at a deposition in March 1896. The attorneys asked her about fence lines, creek boundaries, road locations, technical questions about property geography. But, as Harriet described the plantation's layout, she began including details about its operations, its inhabitants, its history. The attorneys initially tried to limit her testimony to relevant geographic facts. But as Harriet continued talking, describing the main house, the quarters, the far corner where graves had been dug, they realized they were hearing something historically significant. One attorney, Thomas Breckenridge, asked if Harriet would be willing to provide expanded testimony about her experiences at Blackridge. even though such testimony wasn't directly relevant to the property dispute. Harriet agreed. Over 3 days in March 1896, she provided detailed testimony about her 18 years at Blackridge, the household operations, the purchases of young men, the pattern of deaths, the births of 2 children, the war years, the period after emancipation. Her testimony was recorded by a court stenographer and preserved in case files that eventually made their way to county archives. "I've lived 30 years since I walked away from that plantation," Harriet said near the end of her testimony. 30 years of trying to understand what I witnessed and what I participated in, because silence was participation. Those men died, and I cooked their food, prepared their rooms, said nothing to anyone who might have intervened. I survived by keeping quiet. That was the only choice available, or at least the only choice I could see. I don't know if I made the right decision. I just know it was the decision I made, and I've lived with it ever since. The attorney taking her deposition asked if she'd ever attempted to contact authorities during the years she worked at Blackridge. Harriet's response was recorded in the transcript. Contact authorities about what, exactly? About a white man doing what he pleased with people he owned? About systematic exploitation that was perfectly legal under the laws of that time? Sheriff Pettigrew came to Blackridge once, talked to Master Vanderhorn, and left satisfied. What would a second report have accomplished? I had no power, no standing, no protection. I survived by being invisible and useful. That was the only power available to people in my position. The land that was Blackridge Plantation is now divided among approximately 8 different properties, small farms, scattered houses, some acreage that remains wooded. None of the current owners have any connection to the original plantation or knowledge of its history beyond what they might have read in Dorothy Fitzgerald's 1923 article, if they're aware of it at all. The graves are lost. Cornelius Vanderhorn's ledgers documented 25 deaths between 1847 and 1857, but the graves were never marked with headstones or formal markers. They were located in what the ledger described as far northeast corner of property, beyond tree line. Modern property divisions make identifying that location impossible with certainty. The graves are somewhere within those 1,200 acres, now owned by multiple people, reclaimed by decades of vegetation growth, unmarked and unmourned, except in historical documents that most people will never read. The names survive only in ledger entries. Isaiah Pruitt, Thomas Belk, Jacob Reese, William Dobbs, Robert Farley, Joseph Kimball, Samuel Heath, Benjamin Cross, Daniel Fletcher, Christopher Wade, Michael Brennan, Alexander Stone, Henry Talbot, Charles Morrow, Edward Price, Matthew Tully, Andrew Sutton, Solomon Wade, Aaron Butler, Joshua Parrish, Nathaniel Hughes, Ezra Collins, Caleb Jessup, Isaac Vaughan, Jonah Carpenter. Men who were purchased, exploited and disposed of with the same administrative precision used for agricultural equipment. Men whose deaths were recorded as acceptable business expenses. Men whose lives and deaths went uninvestigated, unacknowledged, unremembered except as financial losses in a plantation account book. This case reveals how systematic exploitation can operate behind facades of respectability, how meticulous documentation can record atrocity with the same clinical detachment used for cotton yields, how entire communities can maintain silence in the face of known horror because challenging it would threaten social structures that benefit those with power. Cornelius Vanderhorn died peacefully in his bed, praised in obituaries, mourned by the planter community, buried with honor in Florence Cemetery. He was never investigated, never questioned by authorities beyond one perfunctory visit, never held accountable for 25 documented deaths that occurred under his control. His system of exploitation was protected by law, by custom, by the deliberate blindness of a society that preferred not to examine what happened to black bodies on white men's property. Eugenia Vanderhorn existed in a complicated space, initially victimized by her father's control, yet ultimately replicating his systems in modified form. She adapted his methods, making them sustainable rather than cyclical, permanent rather than temporary. Whether she understood herself as continuing abuse or simply managing her household according to learned patterns is unknowable. She left no diary, no personal letters, no explanation for her choices. She died alone. Her son disappeared. Her property abandoned. Her story preserved only in documents that recorded facts without explaining the psychology behind them. Lucas Thornberry and James Vanderhorn both disappeared from historical record entirely. Lucas in 1867, James possibly earlier. Whether they survived, where they went, whether they ever found freedom or peace, none of this is documented. They exist only as names in testimony and ledgers, people whose full lives and fates remain unknown. What do you think of this story? The documents preserved through accident and misfiling suggest this is what occurred at Blackridge, but documents only capture what someone chose to record. How many other plantations operated similar systems that were successfully hidden? How many other Cornelius Vanderhorns purchased, exploited, and disposed of human beings with administrative precision while maintaining complete social respectability? How many stories remain buried in courthouse basements, in family Bibles, in the memories of descendants who carry knowledge of atrocities their ancestors witnessed or survived? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this historical investigation and want more stories exploring forgotten or suppressed aspects of American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. See you in the next video.